been 65 years since the Supreme Court's decision on Brown versus the Board of Education. I sit down one-on-one with someone who knows all about it, Dr. Millicent Brown, for a special edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. And listen to this interview later on iHeartRadio. The College of Charleston panel, including yourself, explored the 65th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education ruling. When you look back at that to right now, what still plays in your mind?
The first thing would be, I can hardly call it a triumph. The idea that our case, which was decided in 1963, was the first for South Carolina, that said South Carolina, 9 years after Brown versus Board of Ed, was going to have to comply with the Supreme Court decision. And it's really important, Quintin, that whenever we talk about the highlight of Brown versus Board of Ed, it was a very important Supreme Court decision. But I always make sure that people remember 1954 was that decision. 9 years, South Carolina said, hell no, we are not going to comply. And that is important even when we look back at the history of Brown v. Board of Ed, because we don't talk about the resistance. And in this case, the legal statewide resistance, that 9 years would go by before Black and white children were allowed to go to school together. It happened here in Charleston, right, because we were the chief plaintiffs in the case. Right. But there were children like myself and the rest of the plaintiffs all over the state. Spartanburg, Greenville, Columbia, Beaufort, Orangeburg, there were young people backed primarily by the NAACP, and their parents who were ready, because we thought finally South Carolina is going to abide by the federal law. And it took 9 years for that to happen.
What was that resistance like in those 9 years?
A lot of game playing. If you will recall, I became the chief plaintiff in the case following my sister. My sister Minerva was the original plaintiff. And that was ever since 1955, because my parents and several other people in the Charleston community wanted to make good on Brown versus Board of Ed, Topeka, Kansas, that had happened the year before. And so my sister became a senior. And the way the resistance had played out was when my parents would go to Charleston High to get transfer papers, they wouldn't be available. And then as she became a senior, the decision was made that, and this was done through the courts, that her case was moot, meaning you're not going to have a senior transfer during your senior year. So therefore, throw the case out completely. And that was happening around the nation. Okay, especially in the Deep South. So resistance to Brown was being obstinate, not giving people transfer papers, coming up with excuses as to why they shouldn't transfer, or going to the courts and saying, no, that's not the original plaintiff. That case is moot, start over again. And in my case, I always say that my father used to joke, because he used to call me his ace up his sleeve. He had another daughter. So he went down to the courthouse and changed Minerva Brown's name and then inserted Millicent Brown. And so that was resisted, but there was a ruling that said even if the plaintiff was different, if the result was going to be the same, the case needed to proceed. And so therefore, Millicent Brown et al., and there were by that time 10 other plaintiffs. That case kept going through the courts. Quintin, the case stayed in my name for 3 more years. Okay, so to answer your question, how was that resistance? It was game playing legally, but it showed that we in the state of South Carolina were not ready to accept the law of the land. And so Brown versus Board of Ed, 1954, had happened, and some states were complying, but South Carolina said, no, we're not going to change. You know, that whole segregation now, segregation forever. But we did resistance even more distinctly. And it was in 1952 that under Governor Burns that they passed a tax that then was used, a 3-cent tax that said, we are going to put this money into improving black schools. It was called the creation of equalization schools.
And how much money did those black schools receive at that time?
You know, forgive me, I'm not certain I could quote accurately the amount.
Okay.
It was obviously in the millions.
Okay.
But the important thing to remember is that those schools did some good. For example, W. Gresham Maggott on James Island was an equalization school. Sure. And it is interesting because for the first time, you could get a high school degree on James Island. But as I've been sometimes criticized, but I still maintain, we have to understand that that equalization money wasn't done because there was some newfound respect for black folks. The equalization money was done to say, we'll fix up your black schools, which badly need fixing up. We'll give you some more resources, or we'll build some more black schools where there are none. Okay. But the reason behind it was not because we want to be law-abiding citizen. It was, we're going to make sure that black children and white children do not go to school together. So we have to be very careful when we embrace how proud and happy we are about equalization schools. The purpose was to continue segregation.
How many schools were needed to be fixed at that time? Black schools particularly.
Well, there were dozens around the state of South Carolina. But, and again, this went on for a couple of years. This went on after 1954. C.A. Brown was built on the peninsula of Charleston as another equalization school. And it's just important that we understand that they knew that Brown was coming. This was no secret that eventually we were going to have to strike down segregation by race. But as a way to encourage black people to stay in their own schools and not force integration, then new schools got built. And it's a mixed bag. I mean, certainly people are proud of C.A. Brown and Gresham Maggott and the kinds of wonderful teachers and the educational opportunities. Nobody is denying that that was a step towards a higher level of educational opportunity. But again, we cannot go forward remembering the past incorrectly. The purpose of equalization was to never integrate. And that is hard for some people to sometimes embrace. There were dozens of schools that were either built around the state or improved. And so that is, I guess, a benefit. But here's where the trickery comes in. Some of that equalization money also improved white schools. And white citizens, some white citizens, did not like the money, tax money, being spent to give black children quality education. And so they argued, well, if it's equalization, then we should get some of the money too.
Did they?
Yes, they did.
Okay.
And of the first, I believe that my statistics are correct, that of the first maybe 23 equalization schools that were built, 14 of them were for all whites.
Are there any examples of that today? Equalization schools in your mind, particularly in Charleston County?
The process of improving all black schools as a way to encourage black children or black parents to keep their children in those schools is happening less and less. People have grave concerns about the wonderful refurbishing that was done to Burke schools several years ago. And there's this question in many people's minds, unfortunately, because Burke got refurbished and the population of Burke has gone down, 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 because even though the facility was refurbished, there was not a decision made that we're going to make this be the finest example of integrated education in Charleston. And Burke is virtually an all-black school, even in 2019. White citizens, who are now the majority of the peninsula, have not felt comfortable sending their children to Burke. And we have to just ask, is this shades of the past where we are still unwilling? It maybe isn't that parents are saying, I don't want my children going to school with black kids. I don't think it comes out quite that way. But now it's, I don't want my children to go to Burke because the scores are not as good. And because the offering, the course offerings are not equal to what I can get if I send them to Wando or some other school. So we don't hear the rhetoric quite the same way as we did in the 50s and the 60s, where people said, I don't want integration. Now we're saying, I don't want to go to a school where there are this many discipline problems, or where such a high percentage are Title I, which means so many poor kids go. And so we have to be very, very careful about how the language changes. But the question is there a commitment to offer quality education to all children, which is what we were trying to do back in the 50s and the early 60s. It doesn't come out in the same way of race. You know, I don't want to go to school with black kids or brown kids, but we have to be very, very mindful that there has not been, certainly in Charleston County, the commitment that all children deserve the same kinds of opportunities. We wouldn't have the closing of Lincoln, the closing of Henry P. Archer, the closing of certain schools. We wouldn't have schools where the overwhelming majority of children are white, even though there are blacks who live in the community. We wouldn't have this problem of being able to choose schools and being able to go to school outside your geographic district. You know, we have resistance still, but it calls itself by other names.
You talked earlier about, obviously, the Charleston Peninsula being mostly white.
Yeah.
as you know, there's always been a discussion, and still is a continuing discussion about gentrification.
Yes.
How do you define that in 2019?
You define it as, for me, an unwillingness in our political and educational leadership to make sure that as change occurs, that there is equal opportunity for all people to benefit from that change. Change is going to occur. Demographic change. It happens everywhere. There will be different people moving around. And I would be the first one to say, I think it's ridiculous to say you're not going to change. The question is, when developers are invited into your city and these changes of residential neighborhoods occurs, the question is, who are we running away? And who are we running away from? And why is it that affordable housing was not on the planning board? And if we're going to welcome all these new people into the city and these new businesses, did we say, but wait a minute, you've got to make sure that as you bring these new constituents in, what have we done with the people who were there? You know, how did they get to benefit? Or do we just push people out? You push them north, push them up the I-26 corridor. The majority of Black folks are moving into Ladson and past Somerville. They're going wherever they can afford to live. And it doesn't just affect people of color for sure, but especially people of color have been impacted by gentrification. This idea that, yes, we want the city to grow, become more sophisticated, that is not bad. But nobody decided that it was their obligation to look out for the people who built the city, who have been the lifeblood of the city for hundreds of years. Do we just get tossed away? There's a civil rights activist who I know you know of, and I think maybe some of your listeners do as well, by the name of William Saunders.
Right.
Bill Saunders, I quote frequently, said, Black folks don't own anything. We just hold it until white folks decide they want it. And I know that sounds very crass, but Charleston has shown Charleston County, not just the city, has shown that that really is the point. When whites have no longer wanted to live that far from the city, then Black folks got removed, and then now they are the majority. There was a time when we were the downtown because Black folks were not welcomed in the beachfront areas and the lakefront areas. And so we have seen over literally a couple of hundreds of years, when white people want it, and wealthy white people particularly, then we get moved around. When nobody wanted to live in the Hampton Park area, so it got being sold to Blacks. And now folks want to come back to the peninsula, then that area has been bought up, and now fewer and fewer Blacks live. Does this mean that everybody is doing it deliberately because they're racist? I don't think it's that simple. I think that economic drivers privilege certain people. And I am saying, as many others are saying, is it the responsibility of our leadership, our elected officials, to say, we cannot just tend to the people who have money?
What do you call it? Affordable housing or workforce housing?
Well, workforce is a phrase that has evolved over the years. I think workforce is more specific because it says what we mean is people who are working in certain businesses and industries should be provided places to live so they can get to work. When you say affordable, that's a little bit more open-ended. Affordable to whom? You know, there have been lots of arguments going on about what is affordable. Do you tie it to the wages that people are making? And you may say something is affordable because it's less than the highest price that's being asked for rental, but that doesn't make it affordable to the people who are still making below standard wages. And so we have to not get caught up in phrases. We have to make sure that we're talking about what's the principle at stake. Should industries and businesses be welcomed into our communities when they don't have to make any kind of promises that they are going to look out for the well-being of the people in the community, all of the people? Now that's hard, but I don't see us even making those kinds of asks of companies moving in. I'm a part of a group of citizens that's been very critical about the proposed African American museum that's being built. And that's a whole other conversation that we could have. But I and others have been saying, if you have an opportunity to build, in this case, an institution in the middle of a lily white historic district, we had an opportunity to say to the Chamber of Commerce, we are about to build an institution that is going to probably bring in thousands and thousands and thousands of visitors. Now, when we do that, what do we get in exchange? Should the Chamber of Commerce not be pressed to say, but we don't have one black business where a visitor to this new building could even go for a sit-down meal at a black-owned business? To the Chamber of Commerce and all the other business leaders, my question would be, if we're going to bring this many new people who are going to eat at Poogan's Porch and Fleet's Landing and Henry's and all these other restaurants, sure, isn't it time that we look around and say, uh-oh, we're bringing visitors and there is not a black-owned business to compete for those visitors' dollars? I don't understand why when we bring money, be that black tourist dollars, white tourist dollars, it doesn't matter. It's a chance, it's an opportunity to say to Charleston political leaders, Charleston business leaders, and educational leaders, are you looking out for everybody? Or are you advantaging the same people you've been advantaging for hundreds of years? When is it going to be our time? Not that you're going to give up everything to us. It's, when do we get to the table? When will our businesses be taken into consideration for contracts, for subcontracts? If it's found that a business like the new Bennett Hotel, very upscale, is going to come, to what extent did we make demands that we have a multiracial community? We insist that a certain percentage of our community is of color, then a certain percentage of those contracts need to be afforded to contractors and subcontractors. Let us in on the goodies. Let us in on the benefits. We've got to have political leaders who will say, and business leaders who will notice. You talk about education originally. Why does it take a student at the academic charter school to say, of the 800 students, 18 are black? You mean educational leaders that were assigning students to academic magnet for those years didn't look around and realize, hey, there's something wrong here, that we have that disproportionate a number of black students who are deemed qualified? You know, we know that there is genius in every population. Why were we not bothered that our schools could get to be so lopsided? Did our educational leaders look and say, well, where are the black kids? We know there are smart black kids. What's happening? Are we judging them for entry? Well, maybe we're not judging them in the right way. We've always had black kids that were smart. Go back to the days of segregation. We had brilliance. Where did they go? They're still here. So who is it, whether it's a business concern, a housing concern, an educational concern, who was watching and deciding, wait a minute, something is wrong in our community? The advantaging, the benefiting is only going to one group of people. That in anybody's mind should say, red flag, something's wrong, we're not doing this well, and we need to find how to correct it. And we shouldn't have had to spend literally, since we desegregated Charleston schools in 1963. Why are we in 2019 arguing with the school board, where the National Action Network has to literally take over a school board meeting and say, we are tired of being left out? I am now 70 years old. I was 15 when I was one of the first 11 students to desegregate Charleston schools. And at my age, I am now back in Charleston, and we are arguing the same things.
Dr. Millicent Brown, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate this.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, anytime. Yes, indeed.